Do I need an EIN for my self-directed IRA? Hey everyone, Adam Bergman here, tax attorney, founder of IRA Financial. And on today's AdBits, I'm going to be chatting about whether you need an EIN for your self-directed IRA. So thank you guys for spending some time with me today. It's going to be a fun podcast. So let's tackle number one, what is an EIN, employer identification number, and how does it work with a self-directed IRA? So an EIN is essentially something you get from the IRS. It's a set of numbers that you can get for free on the IRS website, or you could complete a form and submit it to the IRS either by fax, mail, and then get a EIN back from the IRS. It's much simpler to just go on the IRS website. If you just Google IRS and EIN, you'll get one right away. They'll spit it out right on the website, and then you can print it, save a copy, and you have it. Essentially, an EIN is used for multiple purposes, but the most common reason why people use an EIN or acquire one is to open a bank account. Generally, you need a EIN, an employer identification number, to open a bank account. The interesting thing about the EIN is the system the IRS uses, their website essentially has not changed in 12, 13 years. So it's got a bunch of kind of weird holes in its system. So for example, when you acquire an EIN, you have the ability to select whether you're the authorized rep or the owner. However, if you select you're the authorized rep, so let's say I acquire an EIN from my sister because she doesn't know how to do it. So I get it and I say I'm the authorized rep because I'm authorized to get the EIN from my sister. When the letter spits out from the website, it automatically defaults to sole member. So even if I selected that I'm the authorized rep, it says sole member Adam Bergman of the XYZ LLC, even though I didn't submit that I'm the sole member. So this is a hole that I've kind of wrote to the IRS literally, I think, once a year for the last 12 years, and they have not fixed it. So that happens. So sometimes when you're getting an EIN for an self-directed IRA LLC, so you want to set up an LLC, you get IRA Financial to set it up for you, call the LLC, Blue Sky LLC, and the IRA is going to own it, care of IRA Financial Trust. But when we acquire the EIN from the IRS, on their website, it's going to say sole member, let's say Adam Bergman, or sole member John Smith, whoever the IRA owner is, which makes no sense because you are submitting that you're the authorized rep, not the sole member. The most important thing to remember with the EINs is, and banks don't realize this, but the EIN doesn't control who owns the entity. The operating agreement does. So think about this. When Steve Jobs created Apple, I'm sure he got an EIN. It doesn't mean he had to update the EIN each time he sold a share of stock, right? All the EIN is doing is it's allowing you most often to acquire and open a bank account. It's not controlling as to who owns the entity. Some bankers do think so. I've got into multiple battles, debates with bankers saying, it says that John Doe is the member and you're here, it's IRA Financial. It doesn't make sense. You have to update the EIN. I said, no. And I give them the whole spiel as to what the EIN actually means and the fact that and I always use the Apple example because that seems to resonate people. It'd be like, oh yeah, obviously if Netflix has a new shareholder, they don't update the EIN. It's stupid. But sometimes some of these bankers just aren't very caught up into how entities actually work. So bottom line, an EIN is needed to open a bank account. It's just a set of numbers, tells the IRS that there's an entity. It doesn't tell the IRS anything actually, because you can acquire an EIN as a single member LLC and then a week later get a partner. Now you're a multiple member LLC. So it really doesn't do much. It doesn't create audits. The IRS doesn't audit EINs. They go to the tax return, not the acquisition of the EIN number. So if you set up a regular self-directed IRA, just IRA Financial Trust for the benefit of Adam Bergman IRA, you do some private placements, things like that, you're not going to need an EIN. You don't need one. You can always use IRA Financial as EIN. But if your IRA is to file a tax return, i.e. a 990T, because there's UBIT or some other return, then, or maybe it requires a submission of a K1 because it's a partner in a partnership, you have choices. You can use Well, for the K1, you can use the custodian's EIN, i.e. IRA Financial Trust, or you can acquire an EIN for the IRA. As I mentioned, you just go on the IRS website, you just select other, and then there's a check mark for IRA, and then you complete who the owner of the IRA is, John Doe, your address, your social, and then they'll give you the EIN for the IRA. If you're doing a 990T, you're going to want to acquire your own EIN for the IRA. But if you just need an EIN because you're doing a private placement or some other investment, and the investment provider requires or inquires that you provide an EIN, you have two choices. You can acquire one on your own for your IRA, or we can do it for you. It's free. Or you can just use IRA Financial Trust. If you're a client of IRA Financial Trust, EIN, it doesn't matter. Most clients just use our EIN, and that's fine. But again, if you're filing a return for specifically the IRA, I suggest you get your own EIN. Now, let's move to the LLCs, right? So now we talked about just a regular self-directed IRA, where the IRA actually makes the investment. Now let's move to the context of the checkbook control LLC. First case, the single member LLC, IRA owns an LLC 100%. Again, same kind of rules. If it's needed for a K1, you can use IRA Financial Trust, or you could acquire your own EIN. That's cool. Just go on the IRS website. Again, if you're doing a 990T, because there's UBIT, you're going to want to get your own EIN for the IRA. But remember, in the case of a single member LLC, the LLC will get an EIN, right? Even though it's a disregarded entity, you're going to want to open a bank account for the LLC, most likely, right? That's one of the reasons people like to do checkbook control. They want their own bank account. They want to be the manager. They want limited liability protection. They want more control. They want more privacy. So we will get you an EIN for your LLC. Okay. In most cases, that's going to be enough. Now, there's a form called the W-9, which some promoters, some investments, even some banks will require you to show that the owner of the bank account is a U.S. person. So there's no backup withholding. In that case, you can use, again, IRA Financial's EIN, because it's going to ask you for the owner, IRA Financial Trust for the benefit of John Doe IRA, or you can acquire your own EIN for the IRA, whatever you wish. Multiple member LLC, so that's an LLC owned by two or more persons, i.e. two or more IRAs. We'll get you an EIN for that LLC, because the LLC will be treated as a partnership, because there's two or more owners. You're most likely only going to have to use the LLC EIN. You're not going to have to get an EIN for the IRA, other than, again, the 990T UBIT. If there's a 990T form required because the allocation of UBIT to the IRA, the LLC doesn't file the UBIT return on the 990T. The IRA does. So in that case, you're going to have to get a tax ID number, maybe for two IRAs. It depends on who has the allocation of UBIT over $1,000. Net income generally triggered in three instances. One, if you use margin to buy stock. Number two, if you use a non-recourse loan to buy real estate. There's an exception for 401ks who do not get the triggering of UBIT. And then third, for both an IRA or 401k, if the retirement account invests in a active trader business, operates through a pass-through entity like an LLC, and there's more than $1,000 in net income, for example, from the restaurant or bar or hotel, then the IRA would file the 990T, and you would want to get a tax ID number for the IRA. But for all other cases, generally you can use the EIN or the IRA custodian, or you can actually get your own. But it's really the 990T is the only time you're going to need to acquire your own EIN for the IRA. If you use the LLC, we will get you, if you use IRA Financial to set up your self-directed IRA LLC, we will get you an EIN. There's no cost. We'll do that for you, plus the operating agreement, plus all the other stuff, formation of the LLC. So don't worry about that, whether it's a single member or multiple member. We even can open a bank account with you at Capital One. So we really take the stress out of opening a self-directed IRA LLC, which is something, that I've worked on for years to kind of not have to deal with bankers. Because when I started IRA Financial back in 2010, I spent most of my time fighting with bankers, educating them how to open bank accounts for IRA LLCs or even 401ks, which is a royal waste of time. So thankfully, I have this nice partnership with Capital One for the last 4 or 5 years. So we can actually open the bank accounts for you, for your IRA LLCs, for your IRA. Super easy. You don't have to go into a bank. You don't have to worry about explaining all this to a banker. We'll get you the bank account, and then you can do your thing as the manager of the LLC. So there you go. those are the rules involving setting up a self-directed IRA and your responsibility to get an EIN. Remember, in most cases, the EIN is used to open a bank account. If you're just doing a regular old self-directed IRA, you can use the EIN of the custodian, IRA Financial, or you can get your own EIN. Generally, only going to need your own EIN if you file a 990T. In all other cases, you should be able to use IRA Financial Trust. And with a single member LLC or multiple member LLC, we will get you an EIN for your LLC. But if you need an EIN for your IRA, most likely only to file a 990T to pay the UBIT, again, you should get your own EIN. We can do that for you, but your IRA should have its own EIN. For most other cases, you can use the IRA custodian one. You don't need to get your own if you don't want to, but your LLCs will get its own EIN because you obviously want your own bank account for those LLCs. So there you go. Hope everything makes sense now, but don't worry. As I mentioned, if you're a client of IRA Financial, we'll get you all these EINs for you. Don't have to do anything on your own. We make it easy. So no stress. That's it for today's podcast. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you as well. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where we drop 3 podcasts and between 3 and 5 videos a week on various self-directed retirement topics. You can check out AdBits, this podcast, every Tuesday. And I look forward to chatting with all of you again soon. So have a great day. Thanks again for spending some time with me, and take care.